So I wanted to speak a little bit today about taking ownership of your practice. I'll have to explain a little bit what I mean by that. I think it's come out of a couple of things, really. I mean, first of all, we're just all in a position where, or at least we were, things are changing a wee bit again, but you know, I sympathise with the fact that a lot of you can't go to groups you'd normally go to. Of course, people aren't able to come here on retreats like they normally would. And just in general, we're all finding ourselves in a very different situation, and often practicing by ourselves, where perhaps we're used to something very different and something very much more structured and understood. And I understand in that, you know, why, and we're not alone in this, but why there's been this conversation about loneliness and isolation and how we deal with that. And, you know, I've had my crack at that as well, and I can understand it. It's a fair enough thing to talk about, but I think if in some way we're either going to hint to or say quite directly how important loneliness is in our practice, then you've kind of left a bit of a gaping hole there. There's a reason why it's so important, and there's a reason why, you know, and I firmly believe on a certain level loneliness is necessary for our practice. So in a way, I'm going to kind of speak about the other side of that a wee bit, and actually why there's such an affirmation and why there's something so, well, I think so much of a treasure in loneliness. And so there's something here that I think connects to something larger in our practice in general, and really what it means for us to be a part of a tradition, and to not just pay lip service to I know that some of you have done Jukai, but what we mean in the Kechimyaku when each one of you are acknowledged as a new ancestor and as a real member of a tradition. Because yes, of course, one of the ways a tradition functions is by passing on wisdom so that we all don't have to reinvent the wheel, because we just don't have enough time for that. But that can't be the only way it functions. Otherwise, you're kind of admitting from the off that the whole thing is a slide downhill, that if all we can do is, in a sense, learn from the wisdom that came before, something's only ever going to become progressively more watered down. So like I said, part of what brought my mind to this is just what it means for us to train without the structure quite so much. And I realise we'll have our own experience. For me, I'm going to draw quite a bit on it. I think just a lot of the ways that I used to practice when I was still a lay trainee, but unfortunately I used to not be able to come to Throssell quite so much, just kind of with my job and money really. But one of the things I noticed was that we can slip into something of a binary, in that we have a daily practice that I think for most people often means I sit in the morning or the evening, or maybe if you're lucky enough, both. And the rest of our time is spent, you know, just doing the best we can to maintain and understand that connection to something much more authentic. And then we have our time on a scheduled retreat where nearly everything is given over to sitting, or at least a good chunk of it. And there's almost this concentrated Dharma. You might either be getting Dharma talks, or you just have more time to drill into something on your own. And yes, retreats are very helpful. I think sessions in particular, you know, if it's the right time for someone and if it seems to be what's good to do, I think they can be incredibly helpful. But they actually rely on an awful lot, and they're a very particular way of practicing. So I think what we all need to find our way with is what it means to find that in between, where we have enough control over our time. And I think we have more control than we would often give ourselves credit for, where we can start to really see how these tools that the tradition offer us, how they really work and how they really affect us, and how we can use them to investigate a call which is very much our own. I think for the purposes of talking about something a bit more clearly, and I think just as a nudge of its own, I would put a bit of a plug for saying that, you know, again, and if it seems good, and I think it's always good to talk these things over, but I do think going on private retreat can be very helpful. I think particularly because it brings this question into quite sharp focus. I know for me, speaking for myself, I'm a big fan of sesshin, but when I go on private retreat, I don't sit sesshin. As I said before, sesshin is a very particular way of doing things, and actually it relies a lot on doing it with other people. It isn't any weaker for that, and I'm definitely not saying that, oh, sesshin is just far too hard to do by yourself. No, it's not at all. But there's an atmosphere generated with other people, and there's a different way that commitment is expressed when you're with other people. I think particularly in the Zen tradition, what it means for us to come together is significant, and what it means for a group of very different people who have very different views on the world to follow one schedule and to all walk in step for a period of time points to actually quite a radical way that we can live our lives if we're willing to try, and if we're willing to investigate, and if we're willing to trust. And when you're by yourself, then there's a whole different dynamic. I'm going to speak a little bit later on about how, you know, a sense of system and structure can actually be helpful, but you need to acknowledge at the very base that if you were to write a schedule and then hold yourself to it, well, you're holding yourself to your past self. And the very first thing that comes up is why. And that why, that doubt, is, I personally think, one of the most useful things you'll ever have in your practice, and actually a very big part of really what I'm talking about today. What it means for lots of different people to step together, and again, it can seem like, I think particularly when you've done quite a few retreats, it can seem like something that you kind of just get under your belt, but I don't think it's quite as easy as that. The radical step that takes obviously isn't going to be there when you're by yourself. So are you just doing it to sit a lot? Well, maybe that might be a reason why you're, you know, going on retreat at that particular time, or that may just be what's around for you, but that's quite a narrow focus. And I think for most of us, most of the time, that's not where the focus is. So what else is there? And like I said before, keying into that doubt is, I think, one of the most consistent ways that we can see actually just how many answers the tradition can answer, and actually just how broad a life of training can be. So I've obviously only got quite a short amount of time, and I'm quite keen just with the subject to get quite a few answers going, so I'm not going to stick on this bit too much. But if you look at what the tradition has to offer in quite a classic simplified sense, we've got sitting, we've got ceremonial, we've got, I think particularly if you're kind of by yourself, we've got studying the Dharma or reading the Dharma. So if you take these three pieces and, you know, just knowing who you are as a person, I think in the simplest sense, I would encourage people not to get too stuck in routine, and also not to see the only way as being expanding. You know, sitting for longer, making your sitting periods longer, making your sitting periods more, or studying the Dharma for longer, or studying the Dharma more. Rather, pay attention to how your mind, to how these things affect you. I can remember once Reverend Master said that on just one particular time, he was sitting for 20 minutes, reading Daigen for about 20 minutes, and then going back and having another sitting period. And again, I think part of the reason why I'm saying this now, that kind of opened my eyes quite a bit at actually how different things can sift to the surface. And the only way that things will start to be brought to the surface is if we're really engaged with what we're doing. And I almost think that that's one of the most useless things you can ever tell anyone. Because if you tell someone that they need to be really engaged with something, or that they need to really concentrate, for a long time, the only way I understood that was that in some way you kind of turned your eyes up to 11, and it's, I'm really reading Daigen. I'm really engaged with what I'm doing. It's like, no. I think a surer way in is to go to these things with whatever is relevant for you now. And that can mean all sorts of stuff. And to give you a couple of examples, for me, it's really incredibly important to understand why it is that we're training now. I think the language in Buddhism and the language in the tradition, unless you've got under the skin of it, can actually be really quite unhelpful sometimes. Words like enlightenment and realization and goalless practice, and you can put a wee pin in that because I'm going to come back to it later, don't actually tell us an awful lot, when for most of us, most of the time, I don't know how to sit to be fully enlightened. Okay, I think I have a little sense of what that's pointing to, but I can't say to myself, I'm sitting now to become fully enlightened, because that word is just so massive. And the way it's described in the sutras is so grand and fantastical that a lot of the time it really just doesn't connect to my daily life. To understand our suffering, to understand what it is about our own life that we've seen and that we know we don't have to live with, that we know we can let go of and see something greater or see something truer. They are the things that bring us to practice, and they're the things that we need to be honest with, because more often than not, and I don't know if it's implicit in the fact that they cause us to suffer, but we're always somewhat ashamed of them. We always think that they're somewhat lesser. For those of you that know me, I have quite a few medical complaints. And if I had a mind, I could pull at least a dozen quotes where the tradition tells you not to train just to improve the body, or not to train just so that you're more comfortable. And I know what that means. And if I misunderstood that and took that to mean that I need to ignore physical suffering, then no, I've completely misunderstood it. And what these things are doing is they're showing you that this surface level suffering isn't the be all and end all of that experience. And the only way we'll ever get through it is by engaging with it. So we need to be honest with ourselves with what's brought us to train in this particular moment. You know, I'm kind of going for the overarching things, but if you had a fight at work, or if you have a particularly troublesome relationship at the moment, or if you're just consistently tired and you feel like you kind of just want the whole world on pause, if that's what's there, then you have to acknowledge that that's the lens that you're seeing the world through, which means that's the lens that you're training through. And when we're honest about that, something can relax around the outside of it. And these things can open up and become something more to us. So when it comes to reading the Dharma, I think particularly, we need to come to it with these questions as well. Yes, there are a lot of parts of the tradition that have something of an absolute meaning. Like Dogen was definitely saying something very, very specific, and well, a whole bunch of his chapters, but Uji or Busho or in the different sections in Genjo Koan. And if you don't approach these things with a clear acknowledgement of how you suffer and what your experience of training is, then you've just got nowhere to come from. I think particularly because one of the first things you'll notice is when you approach these things, when you approach either Zazen or scripture with a sense of your own suffering, if your experience is anything like anybody else's, what it'll feel like you have is an unbridgeable gap. And it's when we're willing to acknowledge what feels like that unbridgeable gap that I think the doubt shows us its true potential. And that why I spoke about earlier on, that why will come up with a vengeance in the face of what seems to be an unbridgeable gap. And it will come up with a vengeance because when we take that step into the why am I training, when we are willing to take that step into the question of does training work, then we will directly experience for ourselves that it does. So when I talk about taking ownership of our practice, it's that this that we know here and now can only ever be our practice. And that actually what the tradition is there to do is to give us a language, give us a context, give us a means of practice through which we can engage with it, which for me then puts the practice, it puts things like ceremonial or scriptures and also be creative as well. I'm trying to talk about a few quite simple topics to keep this thing kind of restrained, but just look at what the tradition is. There's hundreds of examples. For example, for me as a monk, I've got Shozan, I've got Dharma interviews, I've got what it means to go into my master's living room and ask a question, be creative with this stuff. But you'll see that all these things exist solely for the purpose of showing you something more authentic, to showing you reality at its brightest and at its clearest, and that they're not concerned with consistency. Because yes, there are a lot of advantages with a tradition as well established as ours and with the history that Buddhism has behind it, but it can fool us into thinking that there's some sort of syllabus, or it can fool us into thinking that there's a completeness to it, and there just isn't. I don't think I have time to kind of give you a quick rundown of the history, but I'd encourage people to have a look at the history of the early Mahayana, because we have never tried for consistency. We've never aimed for a complete box. And I think that's why we're actually really quite lucky to have Dogen, because you'll see that what Dogen does is he'll pick up a thread and he will follow that thread, always driven by his own questions. Rules for Meditation is a very, very good small example of this. But he'll find a single thread and you'll see him working through his own question. in a lot of ways, that's exactly what I'm talking about. It doesn't matter where you start from, as long as it's authentic. And it doesn't matter that there are maybe things you're missing along the way. Just keep going forward, just keep engaging with that question and paying attention to where it's leading you. Yes, in some sense, if you realize there are things that you're maybe neglecting, then yeah, sure, pick them up, make sure you're not always going to the same source when you talk to monks, when you read, when you think about how you're going to spend some free time that you have. But on the whole, trust what's here and follow a sense of what's good to do for you. So I think I want to just say a little bit about, I think, how a lot of this feels on the ground, and that when I said before, there can be things in the tradition which are actually quite unhelpful if we've not understood them properly. I want to speak a little bit about the goal of goallessness, and that in warning us against goals and warning us against the seeking mind, the tradition isn't saying that we live a purposeless life. And the tradition isn't saying that there's something inherently wrong with intention, because if anything that I said is true, then I think by necessity, there are times in our life where we need to bring a focus to things. Now, I can't go into this in too much detail because, like I said, I'm quite keen to get a bit of a discussion going here. I think it serves the topic better. But for me, there's a big advantage to pen and paper in the whole thing. Your short-term memory and your intuition will, for a very, very long time, lead you astray. Like every other part of you, it is wonderful and it can do a lot of good, but if you don't keep an eye on it, it won't. It'll lead you off in exactly the same circles that you have been spending the rest of your life. So again, just to be kind of brief with it, like I keep a journal, and one of the main things I keep in that journal is, like, not bullet points or anything. I tend to always write somewhat cursively, but acknowledge at least to yourself what you have trouble with, and acknowledge to yourself on some level what you're doing about it, kind of in very meat and potatoes sort of a way. Like, one of the things that I'm really bad for is, I'm sure none of you will be very surprised, I have something of an overactive mind. So when I come back from evening meditation, if I don't get ready for bed straight away, I'm up till very, very, very late, and I have very poor sleep at the best of times. So I need to be really quite focused, and I have set up a system around, and a set of positive habits around what it means for me just to come back from meditation and do everything in my favor to make sure I get to bed on time. That doesn't mean that I have betrayed the no-seeking mind, or that doesn't mean that the goal of goallessness has just gone up in smoke. It doesn't. Or at least, rather, it doesn't have to mean that. Because for me, a lot of this comes down to what the wish is, or what my intention is. And in the same way that the tradition isn't any weaker for not being consistent, and for, well, being really human, is that you're not any weaker for not being consistent and for not being human. One of the beauties of what we do is that, I think particularly Soto Zen, I don't really know a lot of other traditions, but it's beautifully pragmatic. Like I said, the tradition is solely concerned with you realizing something about reality, which is significantly more authentic. So if systems help you get something to a point where you stand a chance to see it more clearly, or if pen and paper and putting stuff down in black and white actually puts you into a position where you can acknowledge something, then it's all for the good. I think, and it's all for the good because we need to acknowledge what place awareness takes in all this. Like I said, if we don't challenge our biases, they'll continue to lead us. And we need to acknowledge just how entrenched these biases are. It can take an awful lot of effort to see these things clearly enough that Zazen can actually start to work on them.